Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
My name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And my name's Laura Burgess and I'm also a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as H. So Olivia, what is your H?
I've gone for halitosis. So halitosis, oral malodor, or bad breath are terms used to describe unpleasant breath odor, regardless of whether the odor originates from oral or non-oral sources. It can be caused by a number of health conditions, including gum disease, tonsillitis, GERD, diabetes, or occasionally liver or kidney disease can result in bad breath. Other causes include poor oral hygiene, eating strong flavored foods like garlic or onions, smoking, drinking alcohol, and dry mouth, which can be caused by stress, medicines, or other medical conditions. 1/4 of the people seeking professional advice on bad breath have halitophobia, aka delusional halitosis, sometimes as a manifestation of something called olfactory reference syndrome, where they have a false belief and a preoccupation with the idea that they're emitting abnormal body odors, which they think are offensive to other people. There have been several classification schemes proposed to define halitosis. The Tangerman and Winkle classification suggests that halitosis can be divided into 3 groups according to the type of odor. Sulfurous or fecal, caused by volatile sulfur compounds, most notably methyl mercaptan, hydrogen sulfide, and dimethyl sulfide. Fruity, caused by acetone, which can be present in people with diabetes. And urine-like or ammoniacal, I think is how you say it, caused by ammonia, dimethylamine, and trimethylamine. And it's believed to become more common as people age and is viewed as a social taboo, and those affected might be stigmatized, which I will come on to say a bit more about later. So that's like what it is, but a bit more about the history of halitosis. The word comes from the Latin word halitus, which means breath, and the Greek suffix osis, which is a pathological process. The earliest known mention of bad breath comes from ancient Egypt. The Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BCE describes tablets or pastils to cure bad breath containing cinnamon, myrrh, and honey. And Hippocrates suggested a mixture of salt, alum, and vinegar, and also a mouthwash of red wine and spices, which is interesting given that alcohol-containing mouthwashes are now thought to dry out the mouth, which can lead to increased microbial growth and continue bad breath. Hippocrates also believed that girls should have pleasant breath, making sure to always wash her mouth with wine, anise, and dill seeds.
Does that mean it doesn't matter or it's good for men to have bad breath by contrast?
No, I think there's just an over-focus on women. It's the social aspect. Pliny the Elder also, in his early encyclopedia, advised to impart sweetness to the breath. It's recommended to rub the teeth with ashes of burnt mouse dung and honey, which sounds delicious.
I prefer the wine.
Yes, wine might be nicer. Pliny also said that picking your teeth with porcupine quill was recommended, but a vulture's feather would sour the breath. And then Greco-Roman medical traditions sort of positioned breath as natural, philosophical, and cosmological, so that as those traditions were continued in medieval Christian Europe, Galen's idea of pneuma, which is the product of inhaled air that passed through the lungs into the left ventricle of the heart before being ignited with hot blood. The idea of pneuma was intertwined with imagery around the Holy Spirit moving through breath. And so to the medieval mind, internal air was something that could be corrupted inside the body and spread outwards through the mouth. So foul breath could be interpreted as festering corruption and demons, both a moral imbalance and an imbalance of humours. So back to the wine, actually. Remedies involving wine, honey, and herbs sort of carried on, but other cures also include fumigation and surgical intervention. And there was also a wide held belief that caries, I don't know, the lesions, caries, and bad breath were caused by toothworms, which I haven't investigated further because the thought terrified me. There's always been an awareness of the antisocial aspects of bad breath, and therefore people have always sought to counteract it. But it wasn't really until the 19th century that the condition became a medical diagnosis. The term halitosis was first used in 1874 by physician Joseph William Howe in his book The Breath and the Diseases Which Give It a Fetid Odour to describe the condition of bad breath. And it's from that period that mass-produced mouthwash starts to appear. In 1879, Dr. Joseph Lawrence created Listerine, an antiseptic surgical disinfectant that was named after Dr. Joseph Lister, the first surgeon to perform an operation in a sterilized chamber. And in 1881, Lawrence transferred ownership of Listerine formula to Lambert, who established the Lambert Pharmaceutical Company to manufacture and market Listerine. Listerine continued to be used as a surgical disinfectant, but it was also pitched as a deodorant, a floor cleaner, an anti-dandruff treatment, and a cure for diseases from dysentery to gonorrhea. In the 1920s, brothers Gerard and Marion Lambert were deciding what should become Listerine's primary selling point, and they seized on the idea of halitosis. And that term was leveraged heavily in marketing campaigns, which emphasized the social implications of bad breath and capitalized on wider trends of the time, like a growing awareness and fear of germs and their spread, and an anti-Victorian trend towards openly mentioning bodily functions in advertising. And from the 1930s, Listerine ran ads featuring bridesmaids whose breath condemned them to spinsterhood, mothers who were shunned by their own children, and men who had everything but were still social pariahs. The campaign was so successful that marketing historians called it the halitosis appeal, and Gerard Lambert worried that he would be remembered only as the father of halitosis. So yeah, that's like a little potted history of bad breath. I've got some lovely cultural references too, though.
What are your cultural references?
So just to pick back up on what you said about, is it mainly women that are talked about? Ovid advised that a seductive woman must learn how to dance, hide her bodily blemishes, and refrain from laughing if she had a black tooth. She whose breath is tainted should never speak before eating, and she should always stand at a distance from her lover's face. And there's something that I know we've referenced before. I think episode F, when we talked about farting, the Miller's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. Absalom is preparing for a kiss with the other main character, and he scents his breath with cardamom and licorice, and then he ends up kissing her on the bum rather than on the lips. In Much Ado About Nothing, Benedict says of Beatrice, if her breath were as terrible as her terminations, there were no living near her. She would infect to the North Star. So it's quite often referenced in literature, but also in folklore, specifically Scottish folklore. There's a creature called the Knuckleavy, I think is how you say it, which was a sea-dwelling demon with toxic breath that could make livestock sick and crops wilt. It was considered responsible for epidemics and drought. And specifically in 1722, in the Isle of Stronsay, they began burning seaweed to create soda ash, which is an alkali used to treat acidic soil, and it's used in soap and glass manufacture as well. And the pungent smoke emitted during the process was believed to have angered the Knuckleavy, who it was thought infected the horses of Stronsay with a deadly disease to exact revenge against the islanders for burning seaweed. And the infection subsequently spread to all the other islands involved in the industry, which is a bit of a weird one. Bad breath causing horses to go wild.
There's usually, though, isn't there, some sort of underlying... I definitely remember being told the tales of, that if you go below the waterline at night, then, the creatures will get you. And it's a very weird story, but it's ultimately telling kids not to play in the sea at night time. So, I don't know, brush your teeth. I'm not sure what the message is, but there's probably a message there.
Yeah, there's maybe like a relation between like drowning and having your breath stolen.
But it's interesting as well how these things sort of interconnect so much. So everything that you've been saying really reminds me when we did the armpit episode and we talked about sweating and deodorant. Because the first step of advertising is create a paranoia about that thing and then create the solution to that thing. So it's a lot of that stuff is very reminiscent of things we talked about before.
Yeah, it's the good old Victorian mindset. Create the problem, then solve it.
Medicalizing everything, as well, even things which are perhaps not a disease. So my H is hemlock. So hemlock, also known as poison hemlock, is part of the carrot, parsley, and celery family. It also is known as poison parsley, the devil's bread, and the devil's porridge. And it's sometimes confused with wild carrot, so it looks very similar. The plant looks very similar. It's native to Europe and to North Africa, but it has been introduced to many other places. So it now grows in the Americas, Australia, Asia, but it's not originally native to there. It grows up to 8 feet tall, and apparently, I haven't smelt it myself, but apparently it has a very distinctive and very unpleasant smell, which some people have likened to cat urine.
Ooh.
So if you smell cat urine on a plant, do not touch that plant. It's either got cat urine on it or it's hemlock. One of the two. So all of the hemlock plant is toxic. So a lot of other poisonous plants, it's specifically either the roots or the leaves. With hemlock, it's every single bit of it. It's roots, leaves, seeds, everything is toxic. And it continues to be toxic long after it has died. So you can't go, oh, this is 3 years old, it's dried, it's withered, it's fine. That's not the case. It is still toxic. Now, just in case anybody's listening in North America, just to confuse matters, there is a different plant that is called hemlock there, which is not the same as hemlock everywhere else, and that is not poisonous. But please don't take any of this as culinary or medical advice, just in case.
Someone got their taxonomies twisted then, if there's a poison one and a not poison one.
It's not helpful. But yes, that is only North America. So it is poisonous to all mammals. So there are plenty of recorded cases of cattle, pigs, sheep, horses dying from eating hemlock. It's not human specific. So how it actually works is, and this is where I have definitely found this information in an article. I'm not a scientist. That's my disclaimer here. It contains an alkaloid which does a bunch of different things. And this is why hemlock is so dangerous in particular, is because a lot of poisons do a thing to your body. Hemlock does lots of bad things simultaneously. So it acts on your nervous system to cause respiratory collapse. It acts on your thermoregulatory center to cause hypothermia. It causes awful problems for pregnant women and their fetuses. It increases heart rate. It also has a toxic effect on the kidneys by constriction of urinary bladder sphincter. So it results in a very damaging accumulation of urine. So it's kind of attacking you in all these different ways simultaneously. So that is one of the reasons why it is particularly dangerous. So there's a lot of quite dubious mythology, tied in with it. I say dubious mythology. Mythology is not typically factually accurate, but it's very difficult to decipher what actually hemlock was used for or did in the past, because it is so tied in with stories of gods and the actions of gods, but also with philosophers, with rulers. There's a lot of myths that have built up around it. One of the stories that is told is that it can enter the human food chain via meat and dairy, but apparently studies have disproven this. You can't ingest it via eating a cow that has ingested it. That's not how it works. But one of the big uses for hemlock in the past that is documented is the fact that in ancient Greece it was used to poison condemned prisoners. So it was the standard method of execution, or one of the standard methods of execution. And that leads me on to probably the most famous incident of hemlock use, which was to poison Socrates. So Socrates, the philosopher, was accused of corrupting the minds of young men in Athens with his philosophies, with his ideas. He stood trial and he was condemned to death by hemlock. Now, all of that, it appears, is true. What happens next, though, is that the account of Socrates' death is told by Plato. And a lot of that version may or may not be true and is probably a story or a version of things, so we can't necessarily take all of that as fact. But according to Plato, Socrates bravely downed a cup of hemlock and asked the executioner what he was supposed to do next. And the executioner told him, and this is a quote, "Walk around until your legs begin to go numb, then lie down and die." So Socrates walked around completely silent, although he did say to his friends, don't be so emotional. This is not a time for emotion. He was very keen to have a very dignified and quiet death. And as he felt his body sort of become paralyzed, he lay down. The executioner pinched him all over to make sure that he was going numb. And the executioner then said, "When it reaches your heart, it will be over." So Socrates covered his face, he lay there quietly. And then his sort of famous last words, he uncovered his face with a cloth and turned to his friend and said, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay it and don't forget." Covered his face, and then he died. And it does seem that it was very important to Plato that Socrates had this very quiet and dignified and calm death. It may be that he was going, I can't believe I'm dying. This hurts. But that wasn't the version of the story that Plato wanted to be set in stone.
It doesn't, from what you said about how it affects you, it doesn't sound like it would be quick or painless necessarily. So the idea of someone being stoic whilst they're being poisoned seems probably not likely.
I'm definitely with you. I think I can see why Plato wanted to create that story, but it seems like, I don't think you're sitting quietly waiting. As you say, it's slow and it's probably quite painful.
The idea that he shouts out about a rooster at the end, though, that I can believe, although it is quite funny.
Lots of people have theories about what that actually means. I can't find anything that says this is definitively what he actually meant when he said that. So yes, there's different versions. So Asclepius being the god of healing or the god of medicine. And so what allegedly he means that he is thanking the gods, the god of medicine, for making his death painless. So we owe Asclepius, we owe the god of medicine a gift for making this death that I am having right now not as bad as it could be. But yeah, it's up for debate, I think, what exactly that means.
I can picture Crito just being utterly confused by that statement.
Yeah, it's like a kind of crazy sort of if you turn to somebody and go, "Oh, my Play-Doh's in my shoe" or something, and you just go, "What?" It's just words, isn't it?
Like when people talk in their sleep and it's just nonsense
Yeah.
utter nonsense. Yeah.
That is what it feels like. And then for, hundreds, thousands of years, we're all sitting there going, it's Plato's in his shoe. What does that mean? It means nothing. Hemlock was used in medicine, and it was, in a sense, effective. It obviously has an effect. It's not inert. So it's used to relieve arthritis. It's used as a sedative, and it does work to do those things. But of course, there is an enormous risk because there is such a fine line between what is a dose which works and what is a dose which will cause you a lot of damage. So it's not ideal. It does appear in a lot of early herbals, a lot of early botanical medical texts, but often telling you not to use it. So you'll get an illustration of the plant and a description of the plant, but often it will just say, do not use this for anything, but know what it looks like so that you can avoid it. Do not experiment with potential uses for this, it will kill you. Sometimes it was recommended for external use only, so, use on wounds and things, but not for ingesting. More recently than that, in the mid-18th century, there's an Austrian physician, Anton van Stoik, who wrote a book about the medicinal nature of hemlock, and he did various experiments with hemlock. He concluded that hemlock did have some uses, but that he didn't necessarily recommend it because the risk sort of outweighed the benefits.
It does sound like it's kind of if there's a numbing and a hypothermic effect, a bit like an old school deep heat, like just topical application.
External application only, fair enough.
Yeah.
I think the problem, if you could find, and there may well be one, but if you could find a medicine that did one of the things it did, that could work as a sedative, but the problem is while it's having its sedative effect, it's also destroying your kidneys. So it's sort of, swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what's your H then, Laura?
So my H is hysteria. So that is a very interesting disorder that usually affected women for a time. I'll go more into that. So basically, hysteria originates from the Greek word hysteria, meaning uterus. And ancient Egypt and Greek medical practitioners believed that hysteria was a physical ailment caused by a wandering womb. So what they thought was that the womb would just have a little journey around the body and disrupt other organs, therefore causing symptoms. And these symptoms were vast and sometimes not very specific. So I have a list here: shortness of breath, anxiety, insomnia, fainting, amnesia, paralysis, pain, spasms, convulsive fits, vomiting, deafness, bizarre movements, seizures, inability to speak, hallucinations, and infertility, just to name a few. A lot of historians now kind of look back and have argued that European physicians from the, 15, 16, 1700s kind of used it as a coverall diagnosis. If they weren't entirely sure what someone was suffering from, they'd just be like, probably hysteria. But just going back to its origins, like I said, it was in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. To not diagnose, because they kind of just would look at the patient, but to treat hysteria, they would use a variety of techniques, one of them being using smelling salts, or they would use very strong smelling things to essentially encourage the uterus to go back to where it should be. So either placing the smell near the nose or placing it by the vagina to essentially encourage it to flee back to the lower abdomen where it belongs. So, which I thought was quite an interesting approach. So in the 5th century, Hippocrates furthered the notion that the uterus was responsible for hysteria, which he thought should be treated through marriage and pregnancy. So there's a lot of discussion with practitioners saying that the womb could wander because it wasn't being occupied. So therefore, women should just keep getting knocked up to avoid hysteria. And obviously, being pregnant, you therefore had to be married. So there's kind of very interesting social aspects to that. So it kind of shows that hysteria was seen as a physical ailment. And then we move to the Middle Ages and Renaissance, where they have a bit of a flip. And they're like, hysteria isn't physical, it is demons. And and during the Middle Ages, symptoms that ancient Greek and ancient Egyptians identified as hysteria, so we're thinking convulsions, trances, hallucinations, unusual movements, I guess passing out was another one, was actually witchcraft and demon possession. So they put away the smelling salts and then decided to persecute and punish them instead. So now we're moving away from demons and witchcraft to the 17th and 18th century, where medicine is slowly kind of developing and kind of specializing. And we see the early makings of psychiatry and psychology. And there's an English physician called Thomas Sydenham in the 17th century who recognized hysteria as a nervous disorder. So kind of moving away from physical and demonic to more of a psychological issue. And by the 18th century, we're seeing hysteria kind of become a bit fashionable. And quote unquote, I would say that it was becoming quite a consistent diagnosis for the upper classes of European women, where, and I'm sure some of you have seen, I guess, in kind of books or movies about that time of like fainting spells and using smelling salts to kind of come back to consciousness. So I kind of found that quite an interesting correlation to early uses of very strong smells. But yes, so we were starting to see kind of hysteria become kind of a coverall diagnosis for women displaying, depressive episodes or, not feeling very happy with their lives, which is quite funny when you think about women being forced to marry and have lots and lots of kids, and then being like, what's wrong with you? Hysteria. Not that, you've got a very hard life. So we then kind of, again, move a bit further on. So hysteria is still about, and we are looking to people like Sigmund Freud, who then grabs the diagnosis and is like, no, this isn't psychological, it's psychosomatic or psychoanalytical, in which he has these theories of conversion therapy. So essentially people experiencing emotional distress and therefore displaying physical symptoms. And luckily, then by the 20th century, physicians have started to realise that hysteria is a bit of a catch-all phrase and diagnosis that really doesn't benefit anyone, especially women. And I think it was then deleted from the 1980s DSM-3 completely. So now it's kind of, as we hear of hysteria, it's more, I think, a lot of social connotations to it. One of the things I noted is the comment of the hysterical woman that we still hear today, which obviously has its roots in the diagnosis of hysteria. I'm going to go back and say that obviously it was connected to uterus, but by, I think, the 17th and 18th century, men could also be diagnosed with hysteria. So once they kind of left behind that it was connected to uterus, but as we all know, the uterus makes women very weak. And I'm saying this in quotations. I realise this is a podcast and not video in which I'm trying to express my sarcasm. But yeah, so they kind of, obviously we can talk all day about sexism in the history of medicine, but hysteria was found quite an interesting example of that, because it did kind of move to be applied to men after it was kind of not completely detached from the uterus, but kind of left behind, I guess.
When I found examples from the 18th century of men being described as suffering from hysteria, they also describe the men as being woman-like. It almost feels like it could be shades of homophobia.
Mm-hmm.
That they are the more feminine men. It's tied in with, the men are cast as having lots of sort of negative characteristics and
Mm-hmm.
being quite similar to women. And so it's like becomes this sort of odd thing where it's like, yes, men can have hysteria, but it's not, big manly whatever men. It's quite an odd way of, you wouldn't want to have that diagnosis as a man, because it comes along with all these sort of pejorative negative things.
Yeah, I mean, it's still very gendered, like despite the physicians kind of developing it and saying that it can affect men as well as women. It isn't a disorder, like you said, that is you want to find yourself being diagnosed with either as a man or as a woman. But yeah, this kind of idea, like the behaviours behind it, like the kind of, which I guess if we're looking at the time period of like the 18th and 19th century, where this terminology, the diagnosis is still very rampant in early psychiatry. It is very much seeing this idea of men not being able to show emotions. So then to them be displaying things like the physicalities of it, like, fainting spells, seizures, but then bizarre movements, hallucinations, anxiety, just having anxiety, you've got hysteria. So it is kind of interesting to see how men being diagnosed with it is kind of the feminizing of them and being quite derogatory, and the way in which you solve that. I guess at that point, we're moving away from marriage and kids as a sole thing, because I feel like that wouldn't really help men, but would, or maybe the marriage part, but not the kids. But maybe kind of then we're moving into the moral therapy of asylums, where you just need to rest for a bit and be able to become a functioning part of society again. But until then, you need to chill and stop displaying these disgusting behaviours. Quote, and again, sarcasm. I feel like I have to put it there.
I agree with you, definitely, and it feels like you were saying, like, it's a way of not looking too deeply at things, because, I mean, in the 18th century, there were a lot of women who were diagnosed as hysterical in charitable infirmaries and dispensaries, and so these are very, very poor people. And I'm convinced, and I know you're not supposed to do retrospective diagnosis of people, but I am convinced that there was a lot of malnutrition because these were incredibly poor women. And so a lot of the symptoms of hysteria were actually symptoms of just being incredibly deprived of vitamins and iron and just not eating. Also, people didn't drink enough fluids because of the huge risk in the water of cholera and things like that. So it does feel like, as you say, like they just jumped to hysteria, and that's a way of not looking too deeply at like what is actually going on with these people. If they haven't eaten in a week, that's going to do something to you,
Yeah, I might start seeing things if I haven't eaten all week.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.